I'm going to start my talk now, if that's okay. So hi, again, I'm Herb. I work with Rehumanize International. If you've made it here and made it through all my announcements and made it through our video and still don't know, we are a nonprofit that exists to end violence against human beings in all stages of life and in all circumstances. So let's get started. The title of this talk is Bad Words. What exactly are bad words? I think when I hear that phrase, the first thing that comes to my mind are a couple of four-letter expletives. And while those words are certainly rude to use in a number of contexts, they're not really what I'm focusing on today. The bad words that I'm talking about are the ones that seek to dehumanize. These often take the form of slurs, words that seek to other a certain class of human beings based on race, nationality, ability, gender identity, sexual orientation, or other immutable characteristics. These words tend to be obvious. You know the slurs that I'm thinking of. Slurs are used by people with certain privilege to intentionally other and dehumanize those below them on the social hierarchy. What is perhaps even more insidious than these intentionally dehumanizing slurs, though, is language that dehumanizes unintentionally. This is because well-meaning people like ourselves can often get caught up in it accidentally. So I want to talk a little bit about that today. But before I do so, let's take a step back. Why does any of this matter? Who cares if our words dehumanize? They're just words, sticks and stones, get over it, liberals. Well, for two reasons. The first is that the words that we use shape our perceptions. By using dehumanizing language, we can negatively shape the way that we view groups of people. We begin to see them as subhuman. As studies have shown, when we view someone as less than us, it creates a psychological separation, which makes it easier to commit violence or permit violence to be perpetrated against them. Something I'm sure I don't have to tell a crowd of people who willingly showed up to a Rehumanize conference is that each and every human being has the inherent dignity by virtue of our shared humanity. What I'm arguing is that our language should reflect that. Think historically. What are ways that whole groups of people have been subjugated under the law? Slavery, the Holocaust, the genocide of the indigenous peoples of the Americas. In all of these cases and more, before mass violence was able to be perpetrated against these groups, dehumanization had to occur. If you look in your goodie bags, and you don't have to do this now, you'll find these cards that Rehumanize made up a couple years ago. I think they're a really effective tool to sort of talk about this issue if you're a visual learner. On it, we go through the different ways that historically and today, different groups have been marginalized by those in power. We also sell them on our website in packs, so if you would like to get like 50 of them, talk to us. But also feel free to take them from the table outside to give to friends. But I think what is most fascinating about them is how they illustrate the parallels between historical and modern forms of dehumanization. The Nazis openly referred to Jewish people as parasites and other animals, a rhetorical move that the American media, of course, condemned at the time, while then turning around and calling the Japanese yellow vermin to justify things like immoral internment, desecration of Japanese soldiers' bodies, and eventually the mass murder of civilians in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In fact, 2 days after hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children were killed by the American military with the atomic bombs, our president, Democrat Harry S. Truman, defended the decision when he said, "The only language they seem to understand is the one we have been using to bombard them. When you have to deal with a beast, you have to treat him like a beast. It is most regrettable, but nevertheless true." Flash forward to today. How many people in this room have heard a pro-choice person refer to a fetus as a parasite on the pregnant woman's body? Or, despite mountains of evidence that immigrants actually contribute to the economy, have heard them referred to as burdens or parasites on the system, or dangerous animals. This is similar to the invention of the term welfare queens to paint poor, typically Black women and mothers as burdens, parasitic on the system. There's a common thread. Instead of viewing people as human beings first, there is often incentive to see them as only tools for financial gain or loss. I think this is pretty clear when we look at the abortion industrial complex. who claim to be necessary because they help people facing crisis pregnancies, when in reality, organizations like Planned Parenthood are merely profiting off of those crises by selling lucrative abortion services in place of any actual help. That's why, according to their own annual report, year after year, for every 41 abortions Planned Parenthood they provided one person with prenatal care. For every 82 abortions, just one adoption referral. It's why over 96% of pregnant people who walk into a Planned Parenthood for pregnancy-related services walk out without their child. To sustain their business with enough cash to buy their executives' Lamborghinis, actually helping people just isn't going to cut it. It's why they claim that they need millions and millions of our tax dollars, or else women will suffer, and then they donate millions and millions of dollars via their super PAC to political campaigns. Profit is frequently a motivator of dehumanization and violence. It's not a coincidence that on the other side of the political spectrum from Planned Parenthood, we see weapons manufacturers donating money to Republicans who they hope will champion hawkish foreign policies, leading us to wars and typically dehumanizing the victims of whatever countries we end up bombing. I was first really introduced to the way that we so often dehumanize those so-called foreign enemy combatants in an article on antiwar.com a few years ago. In it, Robert Kohler discusses a piece in New York Magazine that was investigating the discrepancies in NGO reporting of the Iraq-Syria war zones compared to the Pentagon's body count. In it, about the article, he states, but the article notes, the official numbers also reveal a sharp uptick in civilian deaths. And suddenly, I have to scream, stop. Every dead person is a human being. At some point, this has to matter. An uptick in civilian deaths? When I deconstruct this language, I encounter a shrug of indifference, a detached sense of necessity. What can you do? If the dead were Americans, white Americans, would the words be so cold and detached? On September 11th, 2001, there was an uptick of dead office workers in New York City. Since reading this, it's really shifted my perception of those impacted by the military-industrial complex and how my own language can unintentionally contribute to the ideology that some lives matter more than others, or that some deaths are somehow more tragic. It matters how we talk about these issues because it affects how we see them, and on a societal scale, can affect policy. For example, think of the reaction when a public figure dies by suicide. Of course, we all agree that these losses are tragic. All over social media, you will see eulogies for the deceased, along with calls for mental health awareness and wider access to treatment. These obviously are undeniably good things. However, I have to point out a small inconsistency I can't help but notice. Often, some of those eulogizing the deaths of wealthy celebrities are the same people pushing for greater access to physician-assisted suicide in our country. On the surface, this was odd to me. However, when you dig a little deeper and view it through the lens of the historical oppression and dehumanization of disabled people, especially in the medical field, it starts to make sense. Very few proponents of assisted suicide, especially in the United States, think that this treatment should be available to everyone. For example, in no US state can I, a relatively physically healthy 23-year-old who is being treated for mental illness and suicidal ideation, be given physician-assisted suicide. Rather, the patient always must have some sort of illness or qualifying condition. It is for this reason that nearly every major national disability rights group that has taken a position on assisted suicide opposes bills to legalize the practice. They intimately understand that the way assisted suicide legislation has been drafted creates a clear contrast between the rights of the disabled and ill and the rights of the physically healthy. It is even more concerning when we examine the mountains of research that establishes that mental health issues, including suicidal ideation, are frequently comorbid with illnesses, disabilities, and especially terminal illnesses. Assisted suicide, like many acts of discrimination, relies on the idea that some lives are worth more than others and creates a legal double standard wherein Some are given suicide assistance and prevention. Some are given suicide assistance and the others are given suicide prevention. This is just part of the long history of the sick and disabled being treated as subhuman and being given grossly different standards of care. This ideology leads not only to assisted suicide, but also things like filicide, wherein a family member or caretaker will end the life of a disabled person, often a child, because of their disability. In these cases, both lawyers and the media will often present the situation as that of a mercy killing, highlighting how difficult it was to take care of someone with a disability while ignoring or completely discounting the perspective of the actual victim. Think back to the horrible case of Terri Schiavo and the thousands of people who get referred to as simply vegetables. Talking about disabled people in this manner is so ingrained in our culture that I often don't think we even notice we're engaging in language that incorrectly categorizes human beings as mere objects. Yet this form of objectification is all too common. One example is the way that we use certain people's pronouns. Something that I see online a lot and have myself fallen victim to a few times is when people refer to trans or gender nonconforming people with it pronouns. I don't want it in the bathroom with my daughter, things like that. When people do this, not only are they not respecting how someone has asked them to refer to them as, they're refusing to refer to them as a person at all. Calling someone it doesn't remove our gender, it disregards our humanity. And this is being done to a segment of the population that is already at a much higher risk of experiencing physical and sexual violence, as well as discrimination. On a lighter note, another version of this is something that I think all of us do, which is referring to preborn children as it. Do you guys ever do that? How far along is it? Is it a boy or a girl? That sort of thing. And I think I want to bring this up, not because, it's on par with other forms of dehumanization that actively seek to perpetrate violence, but I do think it's very interesting and worth analyzing. And I genuinely wonder if in a few years or decades, hopefully sooner, when as a culture we finally start recognizing preborn life as the valuable human life that they are and that group of people belongs to, if this sort of speaking will slowly fade away, if we'll just start using singular they for a baby or he or her, because they're not an object, and we know that, right? But that said, I'm not calling you problematic or canceling you for asking if it is a boy or a girl, or if how far along is it. Anyway, another way that humans are treated as something other than human beings is when they're referred to as simply property. This concept of people as property has been the ideological basis of nearly all instances of slavery, from the Jewish people in Egypt to American chattel slavery, to the modern exploitation of incarcerated humans through forced and severely underpaid labor within the prison industrial complex. This ideology is also prevalent in the ways that our law treats the advancement of reproductive technologies. According to the law in most states, embryonic human beings created via in vitro fertilization are the literal property of their parents. Have you guys ever heard that thought experiment that's like, if you were in an IVF clinic and it's burning to the ground and you could save one toddler or 1,000 embryos, which one would you save? Have you guys heard that? It's my least favorite thought experiment. Because, having to choose between my sister and my mother doesn't mean my sister's not human if I choose my mother. Regardless, it's sort of a joke among pro-life people that, it's a silly thought experiment and it doesn't help anything. But on a more serious note, that actually happened. A couple years ago, last year I think, a freezer malfunctioned at a fertility clinic in Ohio. It tragically caused the deaths of thousands of tiny human beings. Do you know what bereaved parents were offered when they were seeking justice? A refund. When one couple attempted to sue for the wrongful death of their unborn child, the judge wrote, "The parents may believe that the embryos they created are already persons, but that is a matter of faith or their personal beliefs, not of science, and not of law. Their case was thrown out. This leads us to one of the most effective forms of dehumanization, the idea of the human non-person. It's so effective because it relies on partial truth. They're not necessarily denying the humanity of whatever group they're trying to oppress. Rather, just that this standard of humanity isn't as important as we think. This is why we can have the anomaly of a pro-choice embryologist. Of course, no self-respecter believer in science will deny that the product of a same species reproduction is also a differentiated member of that same species, or that during human reproduction, you guys know this, you guys are pro-life, that there's a genetically distinct whole living human being created at fertilization or conception. Rather, what they will say is that this human with distinct human DNA isn't a human being, or they're not a person. That's something else. And while I appreciate the work of countless pro-life activists who came before me, many of whom are in this room, who have dedicated their lives to including preborn children within the legal definition of personhood, I would like to humbly offer a recommendation for the next generation. I believe that the very concept of personhood is an illegitimate social and legal construct that throughout history has almost exclusively been used to discriminate against whole classes of human beings.
Exactly.
I believe in human rights, not person rights, because the idea of who can or can't be a person is fundamentally a political and ideological debate that has no basis in science or reality. If there could ever be a category of human non-persons, then personhood is either a useless construct at best or dangerous and deadly at worst. If we are going to claim to be supporters of human rights, we must apply them to all human beings in all stages of development and in all circumstances. Earlier today, I said that there were 2 reasons we should avoid using dehumanizing language. The first being how our words can shape our perceptions. The second, though, and I think possibly more important, is that dehumanizing language simply isn't true. In our culture steeped in fake news and accusations of it, I really think it's important to state that truth matters. Without correctly identifying something and recognizing it for what it objectively is, it's impossible to come to an accurate moral position on that thing. And if that thing might be a human being, it really matters. To dehumanize means to use our words to take away the humanity of someone. But here's the thing, that can't really be done. Our humanity belongs to us, despite the words that people may use. Regardless of our age, size, race, gender identity, sexual orientation, nationality, immigration status, or ability level, we are all equally human. This isn't an opinion, it's a scientifically demonstrable fact. We gain our humanity when we come into existence at the moment of sperm-egg fusion during fertilization, and we do not lose it when we cross a border or develop a disability or take cross-sex hormones or commit a crime or do anything other than die. Humans are never objects or parasites or beasts. We are always, as some may say, human from womb to tomb. Thank you.